wait up, you're finally here. It's you, or, well, me, I suppose, just from the past. You're about to go through this portal into Outland, right? You aren't going to believe some of the stuff they have on the other side of this bad boy. What's that? You want to know some more about it? Huh, sure, why not? It's not like we're going to cause some second orcish invasion time paradox in about 7 years' time, is it? Well then, have a seat, and let me take a moment to tell you about my 16 months in Outland. As the final days of Classic drew to a close, World of Warcraft fans around the world grew eager in anticipation for the next stage of this journey, to take that step through the Dark Portal and emerge on the new side of an alien world. Because in the near 22 months of Classic, many had had their fill of what that version of the game was all about. The things that made it special, such as the leveling journey alongside thousands of others, the unique RPG quirks like hunters needing to feed their pets and carrying ammo, and having so many unique, memorable items, Thunder Fury, Elun's Grace, and many more. Yet for others, whilst it had been an enjoyable walk down memory lane, or perhaps a new experience, holes began to gradually appear in their vision of the once near-perfect MMORPG. Your raiding gameplay consisted of pressing one button and then going for many casters. In PvP, rogues could torment you for entire minutes without you being able to act, and player-forged metagaming requiring the collection of world buffs and excessive raid logging grew tedious. It was time for change, and TBC would be leading that charge. Finally, we escape the world buff raid log prison. We can play our characters all the way up to the hour we raid, and that's no problem. Your class gets utility added to become a valuable and wanted part of your raid group. Shadow Priest goes from meme to mandatory, Elemental from to amazing, Retribution from 0 to hero. We get a competitive form of PvP with matchmaking in the arena. The raiding content will be harder and fights will last longer than 1 minute. We'll have less excessive class stacking, and the list goes on. People at the time hailed the Burning Crusade as the version of WoW that fixed Classic, patched up all the jank, and improved the game. But did it? Today we look back at the re-release of World of Warcraft's first expansion, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This is my Burning Crusade Classic review. So, 1 or 2 years ago when I played Vanilla originally, it was definitely the most fuzzy area when it comes to the memories that I had of it. I definitely played it super casually, with emphasis on PvPing back then. So when Classic re-released in 2019, the main part of the experience that I wanted to recapture this time around was going to be seeing the raiding content all the way through, whilst trying to perform at a decently high level. And I can certainly say that I saw all of the content through. For the Burning Crusade, the basic goal for me was the exact same deal, though I'd also started to do something which I find myself often doing in World of Warcraft, which is leveling one of each class to cap throughout the expansion, which I did with Classic without boosts, but more on that later. In original TBC, I was once again more focused on the PvP aspects of the game and barely raided outside of the odd Pug Karazhan or Zulaman, and I never had too many problems getting into groups back then as I played as Shadow Priest at the time. This time around, at the start at least, I was still playing my Warlock as my main. I wanted to defeat each and every raid boss for the expansion, level 1 of each class to level 70, and maybe check out some of the more completionist type content, rare pets, reputations, and all of that stuff. In retail, I'd often regret going into the next expansion and having that feeling that I hadn't done everything that the last one had. So this time, I'm gonna fix that. But that's where we start. Those were the goals. How did it all pan out? The blasted lands were packed to the brim at 10 PM on June 1st, 2021 on the European realm Pyrewood Village. Thousands of people from around the world had gathered in this one location for the lights to finally be turned on and for the Dark Portal to open once more. Though, as more and more people crammed themselves into the seemingly already full server, the layering tech kicked in and spanned up to 12 different instances of the blasted lands that players spread themselves across. A rocky launch was full on expected to happen for TBC, by the way. Historically, back in 2007, TBC launch was a bit of a disaster. Apparently, who would have thought it? Sending your entire player base to one single bottleneck, aka the Dark Portal, was an idea that could be problematic. That's why following expansions such as Wrath and Kata had 2 separate starting zones, but I digress. Because, at least in my experience, the launch of the expansion went remarkably smoothly. No disconnects, no excessive lag, just a bit of delay between the time of release, 11 PM, and the actual new quests becoming available. In fact, it was very similar to how the launch of the Shadowlands rolled out the same year. Maybe on servers with a way higher population it was worse, but I think overall the launch of TBC was a success. So into Outland we went, and this time around I had done quite a bit more preparation. Sure, I had a guild organised for Classic, but I was going to level up my own way to 60 back then, and then start to focus on the group stuff. For TBC, I had practically everything planned: a guild, leveling, achievements, and so on. I took a way more metagamey route to get to level 70. Why did I do that though this time around? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment, because there are some zones which I love in TBC, and there are others which, without flying, are less than enjoyable experiences. Also, it was very efficient to do things this way around. You can go back and complete quests elated to get bonus gold from being at level cap, and heroic dungeon keys required revered at the start, and whilst dungeon rep would cap out at honoured, quests would still give rep after that, so it was the better way around to do things. And you bet I wanted to be able to access all of the heroics as soon as possible, both for badges and the fact that if I wanted to raid Karazhan early, I had to get my attunements done. So my first 24 hours in Outland went something like this: get through the portal, fly to Hellfire Ramparts, do Ramparts for a few hours, get a couple of levels, and then go to the slave pens in Zangarmarsh, and then run slave pens non-stop for hours and hours and hours. It was either level 61 to 62 all the way to 66 in the pens, and then after that you went to Sethic Halls until 68, and then you went and did your Karazhan attunement as well as the Cipher of Damnation, which is a massive quest line in Shadowmoon Valley that's needed for raids that were going to release later in the expansion. I ended up finishing getting level 70 in Shadowmoon Valley, and to be honest I was happy to see the back of slave pens and Sethic Halls, though you did get to realise some strange things the more you ran the place. Like, why did the Cenarian Circle give you reputation for taking out prisoners as they're running for freedom? That's a bit messed up, guys. I might have to have a word with Malfurion about this incentive program. All in all, despite the level journey being incredibly grindy, that was a decision I made, and there's just something about getting up at 6 AM on a summer day to go and quest in your favourite video game with a group of other people who are all on the same page, which just hits different. It really was like going back to simpler times, and that's so very rare and fleeting that you only come to appreciate it once it's happened. 60 to 70 was genuinely one of the best times I've had in a game in a long time. Over time in World of Warcraft, constant criticism has been laid on the addition of flying mounts. They removed world PvP from the game. They made the world feel smaller, and you can never take them back once they're in the game. Shout out to anyone who remembers how flying went in Warlords of Draenor, where Blizzard built a continent that didn't need it, players said Blizz were flying, and then Blizz introduced the Pathfinder achievement, a format that still exists to this day. Anyways, TBC was the introduction to flying. Costing over 1,000 gold and needing level 70, it allowed every single player in the game to soar over the land, at least to soar over Outland, and honestly I've never minded flying too much. World PvP in 2022 is something which has organically removed itself from existence thanks to players opting into servers with a majority of their own faction for the ease of finding groups and so on. Let's not go down that rabbit hole again. Does it make the world smaller? I mean, sure, but you know, Outland isn't exactly massive by itself either. and certain areas really benefit or in some cases require flying to access, such as the dungeons and raid in Netherstorm. There are definitely some quality of life things in this expansion and later ones as well, which I like, and I'm putting flying in there. As for the world, it's a less grounded fantasy. World of Warcraft was built on very traditional foundations. You're an adventurer in a big world. We have humans, goblins, orcs, dwarves, undead, demons, warriors, castles, bow and arrows, magic, all of that good stuff. These were all already very established fantasy tropes to build upon, with inspiration from historic battles or references throughout the ages, as well as plenty of the games that came before World of Warcraft, let's be real. The Burning Crusade took us in a kind of another direction. It's more of an alien world with these fantastical skyboxes, more sci-fi-esque themes through the quest lines with the Consortium and the Blood Elves in Netherstorm, and the scorched earth of the once lush landscapes in Hellfire Peninsula or Shadowmoon Valley. Some of the zones remain among my favourites in World of Warcraft 18 years later, such as Zangarmarsh or Nagrand, whilst others, like Blade's Edge Mountains, the entire zone around Alkindune and Hellfire Peninsula just in general, yeah, I don't mind giving them a miss. The thing was, in Classic, you could miss zones you don't like, for the most part. For example, I despise Desolus. It's too, desolate, and quest guides would always want to send you there though, because it's good for experience. I, however, came up a way to phase Desolus out of existence where it belongs. You can't do this in TBC without chain running dungeons. If you're a quest enjoyer, the route to level cap is very rigid. I managed to level 10 characters to 60 in Classic. In the Burning Crusade, by the time the pre-patch has hit, I still had Rogue, Hunter and Shaman to level, just due to not enjoying the world as much. I couldn't remain sane and also do Blade's Edge Mountain another time. There was another reason, however, that contributed to this, which we will touch on soon. The World of Outland was definitely hit and miss for me, with high highs and low lows. But eventually I did hit level cap on my main, the Warlock, and by that time I had already polished off several TBC achievements, those being for Karazhan, where you had to undergo a colossal quest chain of completing heroic dungeons, travelling around the world and eventually forging the key. I even did the optional achievement in Netherstorm to summon Nightbane in Karazhan too. As mentioned earlier, the Cipher of Damnation had already been done as well. You needed to have done that to begin the Trials of the Naru, which you needed to do in order to access Tempest Keep, which you then had to do Tempest Keep and SSC to attune to Mount Hyjal, where you had to defeat the first boss in there to attune to the Black Temple. Pretty simple, right? Basically just do all the content that came before the next bit of content, then you can get into it. And achievements were fun, like the first and second time anyway. I mean, it was all generally stuff that you were going to try and do anyways, be it for badges or gearing upgrades. On top of that, Blizzard removed achievements and dropped the requirements for heroic keys down from revered to honored much earlier than what happened in original TBC. And I'm not surprised that they did that. If you came back to the game and thought, gee, I can't wait to try raiding Tempest Keep, only to realise you need to complete about 50 quests before you can do it, that had to have been a bit demotivating. And since TBC, we know no other expansions has anything quite like achievements either. I think achievements ended up disappearing from World of Warcraft much for the same reason that the old class quests from Vanilla did. It was just a lot of extra work for something that people would skip if they could. And at some point picking up a new recruit and having to attune them was not an exciting prospect to deal with. I think achievements were handled well in TBC Classic though, and found them an enjoyable part of the game. So what about heroics then? Oh boy, TBC heroics, an incredible step up in difficulty from any 5-man content we'd seen so far. On top of this, these were pre-nerf TBC heroics with mobs that spammed silences, stuns, and clapped your Prebis tank like they were wearing cloth instead of plate. And early on, you did have to respect heroic dungeons, and wait for it, even actually use CC on certain packs. Well, when you were pugging anyways, it was usually a good idea. More organised groups could chain their own CC through packs and burst them down, and certain dungeons had mobs which are just unreal overtuned as well. Pre-nerf Blood Furnace, Alcatraz and Shattered Halls in particular were places where your tank learned the value of running mobs through a Frost Trap or an improved Blizzard, because the damage on some packs was just totally untankable at early game gear levels. And they were fun challenges if you were with a guild group, which I was. I'm not about to try and pug pre-nerf TBC Heroics, so let me tell you that. Don't get me wrong, it's no high Mythic Plus key level of difficulty, but it was definitely a wake-up call to Classic players. The only comment I'd have about TBC Heroics is that they were nerfed very late into the expansion. Seriously, they had trash mobs which hit harder than 25-man raid bosses at some point in time, and I'm actually not joking. Those non-elite dogs in the Shattered Halls, you know, the ones that apply the bleed? Yeah, if Illidan had a few of those as pets, he would have been a lot harder. Speaking of Illidan though, we should talk about raiding a little bit, shouldn't we? So it's no secret that I rather like raiding. In fact, it's one of the main reasons I continue to play this game as much as I do, and the Burning Crusade, much like Classic used to be for me, was untouched territory in this regard. I had pretty much the entire experience to have for the first time ever, and TBC brought in so many great quality of life buffs to the raiding scene. Remember having to go all around the world in Classic to gather up your world buffs and then over to the auction house to pick up literally a dozen or so different items and potions that you were going to be using in the raid? It was like having to go grocery shopping in real life. So much time, so much effort, so much preparation went into it. And then we get to TBC where you buy your food, you buy your flask, you buy a couple potions, and that is it, you're good to go. Man, if only real life meals were so easy to get and prepare. Well, maybe they can be, thanks to today's sponsor, Factor 75. Factor 75 delivers fresh, never frozen ready meals directly to your door. Designed by dietitians to ensure meals are packed with nutrition, Factor 75 offers a whole range of choices from seafood, meat, veggie, keto, calorie smart, and more. Factor 75 have also hooked me up with a deal where you can use my link or go to factor75.com and use code POGWILLE130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. For me, Factor 75 offers so many benefits to somebody that has a busy day who also wants to, well, factor eating well into their life. We all know that in a few weeks' time, Wrath of the Lich King Classic will be dropping. I know a lot of you are going to be taking time off to play, well, you know, 1 or 2 hours a day perhaps. Your schedule might be going off the rails a little bit, but you can keep your eating on track. Factor is simple and super convenient for the level of quality which it offers. Imagine getting a good meal sorted in the time it takes you to do that 3 or 4 minute flight path. And there's no messing about with takeouts either, no having to order what's open rather than what you want. Everything's already sorted and can be good to eat within the space of a few minutes. Factor 75 saves on time, effort, and planning with no preparation required, no hassle, no wondering if you've bought something to go with your meal. Sort your real life consumables for Wrath Classic now. Use my link or go to factor75.com and use code POGWILLE130 to get $130 off across 6 boxes. Many thanks to Factor 75 for the sponsor today. Let's talk WoW. Back to raiding though. You know what else was new? RIP to 40-man raiding, never to return for World of Warcraft. Now we either had 10 or 25 man, which I'll have to say I straight up prefer. 40 is just too many for me, and there were too few encounters in Classic, which really played into the strength of having such a massive raid team. If you could stack your raid, be it in one big group or in 2 or 3 little groups, you always stacked your raid because of healing range. Fights that force you to spread out like Ragnaros, Cthulhu, and Kel'Thuzad stood out because of this, and if you didn't spread on those fights, you were going to wipe very quickly. Most of the time though, it was just little bunches of players instead of really feeling the size of the team that you had. 25 is also much less of a logistical nightmare compared to 40, and I feel as group size diminishes, individual responsibility goes up. And though the burden of world buffs was long gone, it was replaced by something else which, I'll be honest, I plain just don't like either: group-wide buffs. The difference between having an optimal group and a suboptimal group is enormous. TBC raiding is bring the class, not the player. The opposite trend will be attempted for Wrath, by the way. Bit of a sidetrack story, I ended up playing a Retribution Paladin from tier 6 and onwards in the Burning Crusade. I'll get on to exactly why later, but the difference in DPS between having a Shaman existing in your group for Wind Fury and not having a Shaman is around 30% of your damage. I'm not playing a real class unless I have a Shaman, and sometimes you don't, and man does it feel terrible to play. Oh, and of course Bloodlust and Heroism are group-wide buffs in TBC2, and there's no exhaustion or sated, so you can chain Bloodlust one single group. On the positive side, this means you now bring certain specializations such as Boomy, Elemental Shaman, Shadow Priest, and others, which otherwise struggled to find raid places in Classic, but only giving their buffs to their own group, it just felt too restrictive for me. In Wrath, nearly every single buff is raid-wide. There's a few minor exceptions, but I enjoy this format a lot more already. As for the raids themselves, we had something very interesting happen in TBC Classic compared to the actual Vanilla Classic. Pre-nerf raids. Throughout Classic, players lamented the lack of difficulty in raiding content, so Blizzard answered accordingly with each raid tier set to its hardest level of challenge. And I think this decision, as well as how it's panned out for TBC, has been an absolute triumph. Each tier, for the most part, has contained at least one or several encounters which provided challenges to Classic players. Nightbane in Tier 4, Vash with her mind controls and enormous health bar in Tier 5, Kael'thas in Tempest Keep was once again an incredibly long encounter, where you battled your way through waves of devisors, the weapons, phoenixes, and even gravity. Tier 6, that being Black Temple and Mount Hyjal, had a stark return to easy mode following Tier 5, with modern day raid comps pulling so much damage you could even skip the demon phase on Illidan, which is arguably the hardest mechanic in the entirety of Tier 6, if we aren't counting somebody forgetting how to put tier on their bar for Archimon, that is. And then the Sunwell saw a return to form with players racking up wipes into the millions within the first few weeks. Muru was a legendary challenge back from the original game in TBC, and this time he again proved to be just that. Even the most prepared guilds require levels of execution and performance which were different from any single encounter we had seen in TBC so far. The expansion ended upon battling Kill Jaden at the Sunwell. What a climax. A fight that I've said before and I'll say it again, doesn't feel like any other encounter in Classic so far. It's got many more phases, it's got scaling mechanics which can overlap, it's got dynamic player movement to handle buffs and debuffs, it has all the hallmarks of what has made Blizzard's boss design engaging for many years to come, and is one of my personal favourite fights throughout Classic so far. TBC raiding saw us return to the original Karazhan to fight Morose and his entourage again, and to find out, wow, chess really was always just this easy. We saw Warglaives drop atop the Black Temple as Illidan was secretly returned to his prison, Legion spoilers, and so much more. There were a lot of high points to it, with Hyjal inexcusably being the low. Encounter design was more interesting, fights took longer than 1 minute, and there were still a bunch of memorable items on loot tables that players would value for months. Dragon Spine Trophy, Belt of 100 Deaths, Serpent Coil Braids, Zardu, Madness of the Betrayer, so many more. The content that TBC offered for raids overall gets a solid pass from me. It was a good area of the game, and I'm happy that I've seen it now. So a big part of the whole TBC fixing Classic statement was a link to class design. In Classic, your class had one, maybe somewhat viable raiding spec, and that's if you're lucky. Too many specializations were considered completely unviable due to providing no benefit outside of lackluster damage, and were just generally undesired. Did the Burning Crusade fix this? Yes, kind of. So without a doubt, in TBC, you have reasons to bring a rainbow of classes as their buffs help the raid as a whole, such as Shadow Priest, Elemental Shaman, Boomkin, Ret, Enhance. Hybrids can be more than healers, tanks can be more than warriors. These are all good things. We've already touched on group-wide buffs, so I'm not going to be going over that again, but despite having so many more reasons to bring classes, the gameplay was often lacking. Let me explain. So in Classic, you have your big, beautiful Boomkin, very cool. Their rotation is press Starfire and then go Their benefits they bring to the raid are 3% spell crit to their group, Innovate and Rebirth. Read into Rebirth as going on steroids. In TBC you have your Boomkin, again, lovely thing. Their rotation is maintain Fairy Fire on the main target, or if it lives for long enough, and press Starfire, and then still go eventually if fights are long enough, but they do have to be quite long. They bring 5% spell crit to their group, 3% physical hit to the main target with Fairy Fire on, Innovate, and Rebirth. The addition of the extra crit and the melee hit chance makes you want a Boomkin, but the gameplay has barely moved from Classic to TBC. It's still practically one button. Mages went from pressing Fireball in Classic to Arcane Blast in TBC. Elemental Shamans went from pressing Lightning Bolt in Classic to Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning in TBC. Warlocks went from pressing Shadow Bolt in Classic to actually, yeah, you still just press Shadow Bolt in TBC. You look down at your spellbook, at your spell bar, there's some 24 or more spells and abilities there. But then it comes to actually getting down and playing the game, and you only press one button. Something has just gone wrong for this to be the case. This isn't how it should be. Simply put, the class design is interesting, but the gameplay in PvE falls down super hard for many classes. I could put up with this in Classic, a lot of the game was janky, but for TBC I wanted a little more to it. Even most melee classes are incredibly simple as well. Already in the Wrath pre-patch, it's so refreshing to play classes that have way more variation in their rotation. And I know that criticism of class design later on in World of Warcraft was that every class can do the same thing. Everybody has their offensive cooldown, their defensive cooldown, their interrupt, their CC, but I'd rather have something than nothing if I'm honest. I mean, what's the unique selling point of a Retribution Paladin in Classic? People are just going to ask why the Holy Paladin is constantly Speaking of Ret, and as touched on earlier, I ended up re-rolling that for tier 6. Why exactly? Well, the guild needed one first of all, and I was playing one in the alt raid, but in time it ended up becoming my main, and I'm glad that it did, for real. If I had to do any more pressing Shadow Bolt, I'd have probably got burned out from TBC raiding and taken a break. Ret Pala was in this weird place of being one of the very few specializations in the game that had a dynamic gameplay thanks to seal twisting. It's not something that everybody likes, but it's essentially swapping your seals as you auto-attack, and then you have the chance to proc multiple on-hit effects at the same time. If you add in a little Wind Fury, get some crits, you can have 6 attacks landing at the same time, and when it happens, it's a lot of fun, especially when compared to another Knight of Shadow Bolt, that is. In Wrath, many more classes have a much updated rotation, which I feel is really welcome. Okay, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked here, but one more thing about class design before we move on. Threat. I've come to the conclusion I don't like threat mattering a lot. I wonder what tank mains feel about this, but if you've played TBC and now you're playing the Wrath pre-patch, you know it's a whole different ballgame. Threat is very different. There are more tools to generate threat from both tanks and external sources, such as the cooldown on misdirection being reduced, and later rogues will get tricks of the trade as well. And I'm pretty sure tanks have better baseline threat modifiers too. Threat is always either the druid main tank says, oh, mangle crit, and you would have to teleport somebody back from Legion to do enough damage to rip threat, or they say they're getting a lot of parries and the boss is about 0.45 seconds away from doing a 180 and playing whack-a-mole with your melee. When threat goes well, it's a non-issue. When it goes bad, you have to hold back, and it just doesn't feel good. It's not always because the tank has made a mistake or played poorly either. It just happens. At the same time, I don't expect a tank to tickle a mob and generate 20k threat, but perhaps Wrath is a good middle ground of exposing DPS who like to precast AoE, and the opportunity for good tanks to make raids and dungeons look simple. All in all, I liked how classes were designed in TBC, but the gameplay, specifically in raiding content, was largely on the weak side. Next, I want to bring up something which I feel as though is a constant talking point in Classic, but really hasn't been in the Burning Crusade at all. That's the release schedule and content pacing. So originally, the Burning Crusade launched on January 16th, 2007, and concluded with the launch of Wrath on the 13th of November 2008. That's 667 days, or just under 1 year and 10 months. For TBC Classic, we launched on June 1st, 2021, and Wrath will happen on September 26th, 2022. That's 482 days, or just shy of 1 year and 4 months. Which means TBC Classic has lasted about 6 months less than the original experience did, and it feels as though very few people really mind this expedited timeline. If any comments were made about the pacing for TBC Classic, it was nearly always directed at Phase 1 feeling longer than it could have been, which certainly held some merit as Blizzard took the decision to segment Tier 5 away from the launch of the expansion and to have it as its own separate patch. Originally, TBC was incredibly front-loaded with content, having all of the dungeons, heroic dungeons, Magtheridon's Lair, Gruul's Lair, Karazhan, SSC, TK, and even technically Mount Hydra was in the game from day one, and I was totally in favour of segmenting the game game in this way too, and was happy to see Blizzard take this step. If we know one thing about the player base, it's that SSC and TK would have been considered the only relevant content within the space of a few weeks, and Tier 4 would have been left in the dust, which would have been a real shame for the likes of Karazhan and the rest of the pre-nerf content. I didn't mind the duration of any patch in particular, and thought that the release schedule lined up with what felt about right in general, and I'd say the lack of it being talked about in the first place reflects this. When things are going good, nobody tends to complain about it. When you take a step back though and realize it's an entire 6 months shorter though, that's a pretty substantial bit of time. Though these days, not only for Classic but across MMOs as a whole, it feels a lot more people are treating them as seasonal games instead of a consistent home where they will play day after day. People are playing the patch a lot more than the game non-stop. As for what will happen to TBC now that we are at the end of it, well, we practically know what will be the case, and I'm gonna save that for a little later. Next, I'd like to talk about PvP. Oh boy, PvP. We had to get there eventually. PvP in the Burning Crusade Classic was exactly what I expected it to be, and unfortunately, that's not a good thing. Believe me, I could go on a huge tangent about PvP in MMOs here, but as a mega TLDR, PvP in TBC and in Classic in general worked very well many years ago, back when WoW was a constant game for millions of players, back when people played the game non-stop, and back when there wasn't anywhere near as much choice in competing free online games. Back then, it thrived. These days, I think the barriers to entry are too high, there's too much RNG, and the game isn't actively balanced. Those are all of the issues with it. I'll break it down a bit more. So let's say you want to PvP in TBC. Okay, first of all, spend hours getting your character up to level 70. After you've done that, you need to spend many more hours getting absolutely dumpstered in battlegrounds to farm honor for off pieces, whilst also doing your 10 Arena 5 games per week. You're not really expected to win anything here, you just need to farm points for gear. After many hours of being useless, you begin to acquire some gear and can start to fight back and beat the people who have spent less time in this system than you have. Many weeks later, you have now acquired a number of arena pieces from losing your 10-5 games a week and playing battlegrounds, and you start to queue arena. But what's that? Oh no, you want to play an elemental shaman in 2s in TBC? Well, I hope 1500 was your goal, not for the season, but for the expansion, because some classes are so ludicrously overpowered they should have been nerfed yesterday, whilst others are desperate for a buff. Neither of these scenarios will occur though, because we're sitting on last patch balance for the expansion. We're not playing chess here, folks. Part of what makes PvP interesting is change, and Classic doesn't change. It's not so much an issue in PvE because you can still compete with others of the same class, but in PvP, when you queue into a wide variety of 2s comps such as Rogue Druid, Rogue Mage, Rogue Priest, and Rogue, maybe the fun starts to disappear a little bit. And if you do get into arena and play a lot, TBC has some really bad RNG thrown in there that the game just doesn't need. Warriors with their mace stun, oh, and then stuns can resist sometimes if you get lucky. In fact, pretty much everything can resist. Wind Fury procs can pretty much global you out of nowhere. Fear's breaking after 3 seconds due to heartbeat resist. It's just a bit of a mess, to be honest. I had too many issues with PvP in Classic to really get into it as well, but I know there's loads of people who really enjoy TBC's PvP system, and if you do, that is completely fine. You do you, but those are the reasons I'm not a fan personally. Let's move on though. Another feature that TBC brought to prominence in World of Warcraft were dailies. We have loads of them, from normal and heroic dungeons, cooking, fishing, the full-blown reputations built around the daily grind, such as the Shatari Skyguard and Ogrillar to Netherwing, and finally the Shattered Sun Offensive. Over time in WoW though, dailies really began to sour for the player base as they became directly tied to your character's power. Players don't like that feeling of falling behind because they forgot to log in today to collect their 10 zebra hooves and fish up 15 eels, and in TBC I think the dailies did pretty much all they ever should have really done as a piece of content. They are optional, there are some loot rewards, however they are just okay for the most part and are a filler until you get an upgrade from raiding or PvP. They're more tailored towards wanting completionist content, the titles, the pets, the mounts, all of that good stuff. None of them were super excessive, and if you wanted to just grind, most reputations even had some kind of repeatable item or mob that you could just farm instead of having to wait for the next day's set of quests. The exception was the Shattered Sun Offensive, but that was tied to a server-wide event to unlock various parts of the Isle of Quel'Danas and their associated rewards, such as the badge or gem vendors. I like to call this event the War Effort Light because it's still your entire server pushing towards a common goal, but just not in a go and farm 150,000 copper bars kind of way. The Burning Crusade also introduced Badges of Justice. These were dropped throughout raids and heroic dungeons and could be turned into vendors for catch-up gear, and as we progressed the expansion, badges were added to more sources and new vendors with better gearing options. This whole system worked really well in my opinion, giving an alternative progression path for players, giving a guaranteed source of gear if raids just aren't dropping that thing you need, as well as being a consistent catch-up mechanic. Whilst I thought that the badge and daily systems worked well in TBC, there was this sense of there being just less to do for some reason, less reason to go out in the world and farm things such as Whipper-Root Tubers or Demonic Runes or Blasted Lance food buffs, less need to farm gold as consumable costs have been squished, less having to PvP every day to rank, less travelling around the world due to flying, less need to spamming heroic dungeons for prebis. I certainly feel as though I spent way less time in the World of Outland compared to Classic. So I guess we have to ask, now that we're in the Wrath of the Lich King pre-patch, what happens to TBC now? When Classic ended, there was already confirmation there would be persistent error realms where players would be able to copy their characters over and remain in that world if they wish to do so. Well, that's not happening for TBC. Blizzard have already said there's no plans to do this. In fact, I bet they couldn't do it now even if they wanted to. Our servers have already progressed to the Wrath pre-patch. The copy should have already been made if they wanted to take this route. Classic also had seasonal servers, albeit not at the best timing, release too. Do we have any chance of that for TBC? No, actually no. Blizzard have said they do not plan to do that at this point in time. Simply put, TBC hasn't had that same level of player desire to want to do it again, especially to the point where Blizzard would consider opening up anything new or putting the time and effort into creating a seasonal experience. Though whenever they talk about this, they do say it really is dependent on players pushing for it and making that demand. I don't think that's to say TBC hasn't performed well as a whole, it's just, well, it doesn't feel as replayable as Classic did. I know it sounds pretty wild to say, but this very well could be the first and last TBC Classic that Blizzard do. And I think it could be, you know. I want to finish up on a few of my personal positives and negatives for the Burning Crusade as an overall experience. On the positives, there was a very strong start to the expansion, loads to do, even with tier 5 content coming later than it did originally. There was more varied and challenging raid content, and your entire performance wasn't dependent on having to survive with world buffs. Specialization identity for classes was explored to a much better degree. There weren't any meme specs in TBC, and that's a good thing. There was improved itemization, though it took some time to fully come online. Quest items also had relevant stats to pretty much any specialization that you wanted to play, and there was no more of that strength gear with a bit of spirit thrown on it for fun. Badge gear was also a great way to catch up or just try different specializations. On the negative side, class design built on Classic, but the gameplay was still very lacking. If you have 2 or 3 dozen abilities and your entire rotation is press one button, something's gone wrong somewhere. PvP in Classic just doesn't mesh for me. It's not really a format I think I can ever get interested in. Weapon training still existed in TBC. Getting those final few levels on weapon skill just took way too long. I get the whole idea of your character needing to really learn how to wield a weapon properly, but it's just not fun getting some shiny new epic and having to go and kill hellballs for a few hours to be able to use it properly. Threat mattered a bit more than I'd wanted it to. We've gone over it earlier in the video, but I think Wrath of the Lich King is a good compromise. There was a feeling of lack of content outside of raids for me. There was less reasons to do stuff in the open world compared to how many reasons you had to go and farm things in Classic. And whilst world buffs weren't it for me in Classic, group-wide buffs certainly aren't it either. Raid groups were quite rigid and inflexible, and lacking certain buffs made your class feel extremely bad to play. I did enjoy TBC for what it was though. I got to see the parts that I didn't the first time around, and I'm glad that I did. But it wasn't as good of a game as Classic was. Even when the Season of Mastery released, I had a fresh character on it for a while before I ended up getting sidetracked by Burning Crusade raiding. And to this day, if Classic released with some changes to alter the experience a bit, I would be up for it again. I really can't see this happening with Outland at all. Maybe it's just too fresh in the memory right now, but I'm happy to move on for it at this point in time and say that I've done Burning Crusade. You know, typically the popularity for the first 3 WoW games goes something like TBC Last, then Classic, then Wrath. And I've got to say, from my point of view, it feels as though the pre-patch for Wrath is seeing much bigger returning numbers than TBC did. I don't think we're ever going to see anything to match the launch of Classic. That was truly something special, but will Wrath of the Lich King do as well as it's expected, I wonder? Well, maybe check back here in about, say, 2 or so years' time. I'll tell you all about it. That is my Burning Crusade Classic review though. I touched on all the points which felt important to me. Of course, things like this are always highly subjective, so you'll have to drop your own comment down below. As for the future, I have plenty of content planned for Wrath though, and there's plenty already out on the channel for that matter. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, a like and a comment on the big videos always really helps out. It makes the longer form content more worthwhile, so would be appreciated. But that is it. 2 expansions down, 1 to go. What happens then, I wonder? Thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I'll see you all in the next one very soon.